So we're now joined by Dr. David Monyae, who's Director for the Center of Africa-China Studies at the University of Johannesburg. Thanks very much indeed for joining us. Always good to talk to you.
Good evening.
All right, so another African Union summit, and some might say same as usual.
Indeed, but this time around, I think this was a unique one in the sense that it comes at a time when we have a domino effect of coups and attempted coups, as well as the never-ending COVID crisis. Africa's economy not doing well. And looking at the entire summit, I think head of states were overwhelmed with issues that they really don't have answers to.
All right, so different circumstances, but the response perhaps the same, statement after statement, but one wonders if there will be concrete actions.
We shouldn't expect that. I mean, the real political capital of the AU itself, Ethiopia, is also going through a civil war, and therefore there's this a sense of depression cutting across the continent. And I think it is left on the youth and other forces to really make a major turnaround. But there's quite a major lesson is that poverty and democracy do not live hand in hand. They are enemies, and therefore I think what we're seeing is the lack of development. And for us to push democracy at the expense of development, I mean, it won't make sense going forward. I think we really need to think through and not to ignore these military juntas. We have to talk to them. They are quite important. But we have to keep democratic forces to ensure that we return to democratic constitutional governance throughout the continent.
So those socio-political, socio-economic conditions that you describe, are these the fuel for these kinds of coups d'etats? Because they do seem in part to be enjoying some support by the proletariat.
Indeed, but beyond that, there are also global factors that you have both our traditional partners and our new friends are playing different roles on the African continent. In some of these coups, particularly Russia, that has played a critical role in assisting some of these military juntas. And on the other hand, you have the lack of economic development. The developed countries expect Africa's democracy to just emerge or to be parachuted without really aid a traditional way of developing institutions, ensuring that African economies, they do indeed enjoy access to developed markets. And therefore, without that, the lack of infrastructure, climate change, particularly in Chad, the entire Sahel region, as well as thinking of a fight or a move by European Union led by France to destroy Libyan state and Muammar Gaddafi, and the impact of 2011 destabilization in Libya. There has been movement of weapons across the Sahel region, destabilizing the continent. Therefore, I think we are facing a serious crisis that no one is helping the continent. And therefore, I think the youth and ordinary people are sick and tired with some of the sitting governments, and therefore they're not bothered to go on the streets to demonstrate against these military juntas.
You've described the involvement of a number of international actors. What can the African Union do? Because if you've been able to make this observation, surely they too are well understanding that this is a factor. Africa,
it's a continent, it's on its own. I do not think that we really need to rely on external forces, because if we look at whether it's US or European and some of our closest allies, their role is not that positive on the African continent. The United States has troops across the continent. The United States is training most of the troops, including European countries, but we still face these coups, and some of these military juntas are trained by these foreign powers. And therefore, I think we should be worried that we need to insist more on development, on the development of institutions of good governance, and ensure that the AU strengthen its own institutions to advance democracy, and ensure that democracy should be a gradual approach. This parachuting of democratic governance, and as we see in Malawi, we see in Zambia, and a lot of excitement in Zimbabwe, and most of this opposition, when they come into power, they do not differ from the ruling governments and ruling nationalist movements. They are made from the very same DNA. They behave the same: corruption, elitism, and therefore the proletariat are up and rising. Therefore, we see this rise of fascism everywhere, including in our own country, anti-immigration. We see what's happening in the United States, in Europe, a trend that, if we go back in history, it's a situation before the Second World War, where you have economic depression, rise of fascism, and it's really a dangerous era that we are living in.
Okay, again, I'm going to ask Dr. Monyae, what do we do? Because we see the army in Sudan killing citizens. We see drones going into Tigray, killing citizens. The African Union's right next door, watching all of this, and they actually welcome these leaders into the AU building, give them a platform to speak, and that's that.
Contradictions and the statements that are constantly made, and you find that they condemn certain coups and they look at the other side in certain circumstances, one that you have described of what's happening in Ethiopia itself, the headquarters of the AU. And with all these coups, particularly in West Africa, ECOWAS is toothless. And if we look at regional powers, particularly Nigeria, it's weakened, it cannot control its own territories. And President Buhari is quite weak. In Southern Africa, I don't know what one would say about South Africa itself. This is no longer the era of President Thabo Mbeki, President Obasanjo, President Wade of Senegal, and you had Bouteflika of Algeria and Egypt, as well as Ethiopia itself. And these regional hegemons are quite weak, and they're not really rising to the occasion to have that pushback against military juntas.
So what do we do about poverty? Because again, you said this is a major ingredient to some of the issues that are still to come and the ones that we're facing now. When we look at the continent, arable land, minerals, human capital, we are rich beyond measure. How come this is not translating into the most prosperous continent in the world?
I think we're soft on corruption and just general laziness in terms of serious thinking about governance, professionalism when running the state, and building institutions that democracy could take root. At the moment, we appear to be excited about the symbolism of democracy. 4 or 5 years going to election, casting our votes, and therefore 2 terms, and we're so excited and hold these issues as very religiously. I think we need to look at democracy from a different lenses. I think our democracy should be rooted in development, that we, as much as we want casting of ballot boxes, we need infrastructure, we need roads, we need good schooling system, education. We also need agriculture to really work among ourselves, trade among ourselves, as well as when we look at our partners, we need to also start measuring to what extent are they useful to us? Are they opening their markets to us? So those are some of the serious issues that we need to look into before we get excited by friends that we have coming from outside the African continent.
Dr. Monyae, we've got everything. We have the intercontinental free trade area. We have the African peer review mechanism that's supposed to see all of these things and advise each other in a collegial manner. We have everything we need. We've got the Security Council. We've got all of the institutions in place, but they're not working. Why?
Implementation. I think that's the key issue that we have. If we could just deal with the issue of inequality, dealing with corruption, and how we can increase skills in terms of development, infrastructure development, key issues. And as much as we want democracy, we should also be patient. I don't think we can have democracy across the African continent. We need to have countries that are developing also have democracy at the same time. But other countries, we have to accept that we have to live with this kind of condition for a much longer time.
All right. Did anything positive come out of this summit for you that's given you any hope or encouragement?
There's so many. I think the very first exciting an idea that emanated from South Africa, that we need to have your pandemic fund of some sort so that we prepare ourselves in future pandemics. I think that's a great idea. We need to support the Africa CDC in Addis Ababa, as well as to deal with the issue of coordinating having infrastructure, particularly health infrastructure. Those are some of the more exciting issues that came about this time.
All right. Well, we'll keep our fingers crossed that these bear fruit and that we can have a really positive conversation the next time we chat. Dr. Monyae, always good talking to you. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
All right, that's Dr. David Monyae speaking to us about the just concluded African Union heads of state and heads of government summit that's taken place in the last few days, and general condemnation for the number of coups that have taken place in recent times.